Sometimes people say things that are loaded with truth, but in which nitpicking fact checkers are able to identify some technical exaggeration. Sometimes people say things that nitpicking fact checkers let slide, but that are full of illiberal and anti-democratic philosophy. Today we invite fans of Spike Cohen, fans of Tulsi Gabbard, fans of nitpicking fact checkers, and fans of truth tellers to unite. You've all come to take the gold pill. The two major parties in the media can no longer be expected to represent our interests. They control the information we receive in order to keep us comfortable with their profits and with their power. Comfort is not what I offer, only the truth, nothing more. So let's be clear about what it is that Spike said and what it is in his little statement, maybe his humorous statement, that I think is so truthful, and talk about why it's so important that it was called out for being factually incorrect in spite of this. What he said was, a silver lining to the Biden administration labeling libertarians terrorists is that the CIA will probably start giving us money and weapons now. Now let's be clear. If Spike had said, for example, Biden's previous administration's CIA director, Mr. Brennan, has conflated libertarians with terrorists and has asserted that the Biden administration is acting on this, he would have been fine, right? It's a matter of technicality. The difference is a gray area. But let's take PolitiFact, the organization that labeled Spike as something less than a truth teller. Shameful, really. But let's take them at face value. They've been under a lot of criticism for a long time. Frankly, I believe that much of it they deserve. But let's suppose that they're not trying to be biased. The difference between their actions in Spike's statement's case and what it is that they put up with that other people say, I believe is much more important than either one of these statements. First of all, let's recognize the things that are true in Spike's statement. First of all, it's just funny that someone would conflate libertarians with terrorists. Libertarians are deeply committed to non-aggression, the non-aggression principle. The idea that somebody would be afraid that libertarians would take up arms in a violent manner is sort of a joke in itself. The other part of the joke, of course, is that Spike correctly points out that the CIA has a history of, I don't want to say willy-nilly, passing out money and arms for insurrectionists, but they haven't always done a very good job of it. First of all, they fail to clear the ethical hurdle and just staying out of other people's business. But even in terms of predicting who's going to be a winner, who's going to be a loser, predicting where the resources are going to go from other sources, predicting how various conflicts are going to play out, they don't have a very good history. I believe that when you put these two things together, you get something really important. And that is that linking political ideology with violence puts you on a bad, bad path. The CIA has done this in the past. Other elements of the U.S. federal government have done this in the past. The public has done this in the past. The whole idea, for example, of conflating Islam with the actions of a small minority of radicalized Islamic terrorists who leverage Islam for their bidding is, of course, a mistake. And it's the similar type of mistake that's going on here when Brennan talks about libertarians. The CIA has gotten this wrong time and time again. When you pick a group of insurrectionists and believe that because they share an ideology with a certain proportion of the population, and then assume that therefore the population shares the insurrectionists' interest in fighting, this is where things go wrong as a matter of predictability. Many in any population value either democracy or at the very least stability over violent revolution, even if they share a political ideology with insurrectionists. For generations, we have found that war is not the answer, right? The political process needs to fight through some of these political, ideological issues. It may take years, it may take generations, but it requires a great deal of patience. Nobody should be suggesting that someone might say, well, I'm a libertarian and therefore I'm going to go out and commit a crime, or I'm a Republican and therefore I'm going to commit a crime, or a Democrat. This is no more or less silly than the assertion in 2020 that rioters, looters in urban areas were going out there because they were motivated by democratic philosophy, the philosophy of the Democratic Party. It's just not true. It is true that some criminal nut jobs sometimes seek an anti-establishment movement because they feel in some aspects disenfranchised by the powers that be. This does happen, of course. This is where populism comes from. And populism shares anti-establishment sentiments with libertarianism, right? The things that drive populism and have recently caused people to feel disenfranchised either from their government or the culture in general. Things like the decline of traditional culture and the rise of a new political correctness. Layered on top of that, the divergence in information sources on television and elsewhere have caused friction that make people feel as though they are being ideologically suppressed. Sometimes the reaction to that comes out in ugly ways. You add to that the churn in economic opportunities due to changes, rapid changes in our economy, the advent of the information age. These are very difficult issues to work through. Populism does not help, but we all should recognize that elements of populism and things that look like it will arise in any party. So importantly, it was not Spike who conflated libertarians with terrorists. It was Mr. Brennan. I have a statement here. Let me read it for you because I want to get this right. He said, I know looking forward that the members of the Biden team who have been nominated or have been appointed are now moving in laser-like fashion to try to uncover as much as they can about what looks very similar to insurgency movements that we've seen overseas, where they germinate in different parts of the country and they gain strength, and it brings together an unholy alliance, frequently of religious extremists, authoritarians, fascists, bigots, racists, nativists, even libertarians. Not a group lumped in with which the libertarians normally find themselves. First of all, this is just not true. Libertarians do not engage in unholy alliances, either here or abroad, rarely participating in any sort of insurgency movements whatsoever, much less violence. If libertarianism were significantly involved, as opposed to just individuals identifying themselves as libertarians, if a libertarian philosophy was somehow heavily involved in an insurgency movement, in a revolution, would we call that an unholy alliance? One man's freedom fighter, as we say. Really, it's no wonder the CIA gets this wrong so often. But in case there was any doubt about whether Brennan was conflating libertarians with terrorists, his former chief of staff, Nick Shapiro, clarified this for us. Now, Nick said, first of all, that Brennan was talking about finding and charging merely people that were involved in the Capitol rioting. This is not true. Brennan was talking more broadly about finding sources of insurrection more generally. But never mind that. What Shapiro said was, even libertarians were the words that Brennan chose. Shapiro said about these words, many self-identified libertarians acknowledge their participation in the disgraceful events of 6 January. Importantly, this is untrue. It is not merely untrue because Nick is clumsy with his words. He had the opportunity to choose his words very carefully. He was trying to bail out his boss. And in my view, dug the ditch a little bit deeper. How many libertarians do we suppose there are in the United States? What would be a great many of them? Joe Jorgensen secured 1.5 million votes, despite the fact that most libertarians thought there was very little chance that Joe would carry the day, that she'd win the election, that she would capture the White House. In other words, despite a tremendous amount of pressure not to, as some would say, waste a vote, 1.5 million people voted for Joe Jorgensen. So I would suggest that, at the very least, it is millions of Americans who have identified themselves as libertarians. How many people on Capitol Hill that day would identify themselves as such? There were dozens of thousands of people in total. I don't know how many participated in the so-called insurgency. 1,000. How many did so in a violent fashion? Hundreds. How many would hold up their hand when asked, are you a libertarian? Certainly it can't be any larger than a small number of hundreds of people, compared to a small number of millions of people in the United States who are libertarians. So we're talking about 10,000, 1/100th of 1%. This is not, by anyone's standards, a great many. It is just misleading to suggest that it were. How many people on Capitol Hill might have held up their hand if you were to ask, how many of y'all are Lutherans? Is one of my favorite examples, and in my view, no more or less likely to take up arms in a violent fashion against the United States government. Why does this matter? This matters because Mr. Brennan is not an outsider. He is an insider. This makes him a very dangerous person. He was head of the CIA in the previous Biden administration, the Obama-Biden administration. He continues to have a great deal of influence. When he says he has spoken with people inside the Biden administration, I think we should take his word for it. He reflects the thinking of many of our current leaders. He clearly believes that problems are frequently best solved by force. He's a very political guy. He is a war hawk. If he wanted there to be any doubt about that, he wouldn't have portrayed himself as such in his autobiography. Right here. I have read it. I do not recommend it. I think it's a frustrating waste of time. It's called Undaunted. And I would just suggest that for the sake of the American people, for the political process more generally, things would be better off if he were actually a little bit more daunted. He and people like Mr. Brennan are concerned with power, with control. This suggests that one of two things is going on. Either he believes that certain ideologies lead to violence, which means he's just not very good at this as a technical matter. He's just not a very good student of history. Or he's uncomfortable with a long-term political process being allowed to play out for these ideologies to rub up against each other, for us to find a solution over years or over generations. In which case, he's just not very patriotic, as I would define it. It's got to be one or the other. There's no escape. So let's bring these subjects under one topic together. Why is it that PolitiFact decided to label Spike's statement as untrue, but not so with Brennan's or Shapiro's? Why is it that something on the edge of technical truth seems more important and worthy of identification than a broad policy statement with objectively incorrect policy implications. As for myself, I am less interested in what it is that they call out as a falsehood than I am in what it is that I find false that they choose to let in. What is it that they let go? Consider the line of reasoning that was in the statements that were not called false and that Spike was calling out and so concerned about. Bad things happened on January 6th. We need to take drastic measures, whatever it takes, to prevent such things from happening in the future. Rioters claim ideological motivations, and so, adding these things together, we'll just trace back from the ideologically motivated groups to find the individuals that we're looking for. Compromises to liberty? Sure. Surveillance? Absolutely, and necessary. So I have some excerpts from the statement introducing the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act of 2021. In part, the threat is from domestic terror groups and extremists, often racially motivated. The act gives our government the tools to, things, monitor their illegal activities. Combating white supremacy is a serious threat. So, legislatively, we're identifying groups that must be monitored because of their ideology. Let's be clear. The problem is not that white supremacy should be acceptable in our culture. It should not be. The problem is that it should be, indeed it must be, acceptable by our law, as long as it does not infringe on the rights of others. So if you're saying we should not be allowed to discriminate racially in hiring and firing, for example, at least then we're having a debate. It's a debate whether the First Amendment gives you the right to lose money and be a complete jerk and be a racist versus the obligation of the government to protect the rights of minorities. At least then you're having a debate. But there should be no debate about either. On one side, is white supremacy bad? Of course. Is racism something that we can afford to tolerate in this country? Absolutely not. We've tolerated it for too long. We all believe it's on its way out and that there's a great deal of work yet to be done to make sure that it goes out completely and that we keep it out. No debate about that. But nor should there be a debate about whether our government should be pursuing surveillance against groups based on their ideology. Tulsi Gabbard recently identified this problem as one of who will they come after next. The rhetoric has already talked about, Brennan already talked about, religious extremists. Who might they be talking about? Lutherans? We don't know. Why is it that government officials are talking about pursuing people who have ideologies that they believe either they don't like or that are linked to some individuals who pursued violence? When our politicians speak out against racism generally and white supremacists in particular, it's good. It's a good thing. They are cultural leaders, not just government leaders. But when we use legislation as rhetoric, when we end up using government resources to back up that rhetoric, law enforcement in particular, we impose political correctness by force, by government, by fiat. We need to learn how to let people work their way through cultural issues, and parenthetically, to let law enforcement do their jobs. This won't be easy. Politics has become a battleground. On one side are journalists and jurists, regulators, revisionists, politicians and pundits. who believe the government can better solve our problems than we can ourselves. On our side of this battle are things like history, science, people like you, and people like me. We have on our side common sense. I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to help make this sense just a little bit more common. And thanks for coming to take the gold pill. Comfort is not what I offer, only the truth, nothing more.